The jungle noise of bird and beast is stilled by sudden boom and pop of anti-aircraft fire. The moonless night is streaked with a pattern of bisecting tracers. 20mm shells fly into the dark in streams of hot lead, clawing for a single plane, droning high over the treetops. My plane. The guns have gone silent now. The only sight he can see is a greenish blur from his suit's night vision. The only scent is the rotten stink of the jungle below. It will be days before they discover his empty plane. Days more before they suspect the pilot could survive. Days he will need to accomplish his mission. He's on his own now. One wrong move means failure without hope or rescue. And one misstep, well, Batman won't be the only one to die. The mission began only a few kilometers from here, just 3 days ago in Montaraza Villa, a provincial city in Hasaragua. Lucius Fox and his colleague Karen are visiting and are here to consider investing in this poor country. Their biggest concern, which they present to Jorge Calles, finance minister of Hasaragua, is of the country's political instability. Cell 6, the most notorious terrorist organization in Latin America, attacks this nation, while the government, in response, acts almost as brutally. Jorge reassures his visitor that Hasaragua is a troubled nation and will remain troubled so long as it is a poor nation. It literally can't afford to have the ideals of democracy in place. And it's Jorge's job as finance minister to attract the sort of people who will bring wealth to the country so that they can afford said freedoms. As they go to enjoy lunch together, the group is attacked by Cell 6. The government handlers are brutally killed, while Lucius and Karen are kidnapped by the terrorist organization. They release a video where Lucius is forced to reveal that Cell 6 demands $3 million in ransom, and a letter of apology from Wayne Enterprises, for the company attempting to work with the government of Hasaragua. Wayne Enterprises, in cooperation with the Hasaragua government, is able to pinpoint a possible location of where Lucius Fox is being held. Buzz Westmark, vice president in charge of Wayne Corp corporate security, draws up plans for a daring rescue operation. However, Bruce Wayne has an alternative solution that he believes will be a safer one for Lucius. They should simply pay the ransom. For someone like Bruce Wayne, $3 million is a trivial amount, less than what he spends every year on green fees. So he has his company arrange payment and get Lucius home. Buzz, however, ignores these orders, demanding that they continue the operation he had planned, and insisting on leading it personally in Hasaragua. Meanwhile, Bruce Wayne insists on going to the country alone, as Batman. Tim Drake wants to come along, but the Dark Knight insists that the Boy Wonder needs to stay here. He needs his sidekick to help track down the guerrilla camp based on where the ransom payment will be going, though in secret he is simply unwilling to have the young man enter into the field of battle. There's a big difference between the streets of Gotham and a war zone, and he hopes to God that Tim never has to learn the difference between the two. And so Batman takes off, finding his way in the middle of a country, with practically every gun in there turned on him. He begins working through the terrorists of Cell 6, until he spots Buzz and his group of mercenaries attempting their rescue operation. They are attacked and Westmark is captured along with a number of other key personnel. Westmark and his men are taken to be held with Lucius, and when Westmark asks the terrorist leader to help one of his men get medical attention, the leader simply shoots the mercenary in cold blood. Batman is able to sneak into the Cell 6 compound, where he moves in to rescue the hostages, only to discover they managed to escape themselves. With the help of both Oracle and Robin, Batman is able to track down the escaped hostages, and begins to covertly help them make their way through the jungle. With remarkable effort, and a little bit of sophisticated technology, Batman is able to work his way through the terrorists that pursue the would-be hostages, even going so far as to leaving a series of notes directing the hostages towards rescue, while the terrorist leader is taken out by the Dark Knight himself. However, on the way they are attacked by Jorge Cala, who, it turns out, arranged the entire kidnapping in an attempt to levy some funds from Wayne Enterprises in secret. Once again, thanks to Batman's timely intervention, Jorge's copter is taken down by a well-placed batarang, and the finance minister finds himself captured at gunpoint by Lucius Fox. After that, the company men and women were taken in by a government patrol. They took Callis into custody, and he was charged with arranging the entire kidnapping and attempting to divert funds and attention towards the terrorists. Bruce Wayne is glad to hear it all worked out, though Karen is annoyed that the man appears to have very little intelligence behind all his wealth. Lucius reminds her that everyone has their own strengths. Bruce Wayne's are just a little more hidden than other people's. Hello and welcome to Comic Island. My name is Arden, and this is my recap and review of Detective Comics Annual 10. So if you've been following all these episodes, you should know that, as promised, I'd be reviewing 11 random issues of Detective Comics and 1 random annual. And here we are for the annual, published in 1997 and featuring the writing of legendary comic book writer Chuck Dixon. Dixon's an interesting character and not one that we've talked about much on this show before. While I do disagree with the writer politically, he's a great writer, deeply influential on a number of key modern comic book writers in the present day, and also the creator of a number of great things ranging from the Oracle phenomenon with Batman and the general dynamic behind her work at Gotham, as well as the Birds of Prey and other key figures. He's an awesome writer, so you can't imagine how excited I was to see his name on the cover of this thing. Likewise, I really enjoyed this comic overall. We've gotten past the 1985 growing pains that I sensed from that particular issue, from the last episode of this series, and I've now gotten into a really polished take on Batman. We're beyond even the Tim Burton take on Batman and moving towards a version of the character that would basically become popularized through The Dark Knight. A modern, mature Batman that, while not joyless, definitely is much more serious and takes the character with a great deal of grandeur and aplomb. He's this big, larger-than-life thing now, and that's something that we hadn't really gotten out of the Detective Comics series thus far in the chronology that I've been reviewing these issues in so far. But that's all changed now, and it's very present here. The whole political take, Batman working and operating in this politically unstable country and trying to help some of his friends, is a good story, and a pretty interesting one at that. It does indeed humanize this fictional nation, and it does recognize some of the political turmoil of Latin America, though it seems like Dixon isn't really willing to touch on the reasons why that is and where all of that comes from, because he doesn't seem to be willing to acknowledge who exactly would ultimately be responsible for this, even if we're talking about a fictional country here. If we're talking about Latin America, there's only one other country that ever is truly responsible for the mess that is Latin America at times. And it ain't any country in Latin America. But, all that aside, Dixon does a really good job at telling a serious story with a sense of compassion and intelligence to it. I really like the fact that, even though they don't have big roles, the 2 main female characters of this comic, Karen, the Wayne Enterprises employee, and Oracle, both really shine through this comic. Dixon is famous for this in writing strong female characters, and even though they have a very small role in this particular issue, they shine through in a big way, and it's something I noticed when I first went through this comic. It's an interesting aspect of Chuck Dixon's writing, and like I said, I'm really excited that we get to review one of his comics. Aside from that, the art of this comic overall really feels like a big change as well. We've gone into the more modern take on comic book artwork, and it really shows. This is a very 90s comic in terms of its art style, and that is a bit of an issue to a degree. It's not game-breaking, but it is something that I noticed. It works very well when we're dealing with explosions and action scenes, Batman flying through the sky on his little glider at the beginning of this comic, even the Wayne Enterprises boardroom meeting. All these typical Batman stuff, Klaus Janson and Noel Giddings do a fantastic job with the artwork behind this comic. However, certain scenes, especially as we get farther into this annual, and to be fair, this is a very long comic with a lot of artwork to it, The facial expressions start getting more and more angular. The look and feel of characters starts to get more and more into that Robert Liefeld over-the-top, super muscly look of characters. And I start to lose something along the way. This panel, which should be a really big moment for the comic, I just laughed out loud at because the facial expression of this terrorist leader looks so ridiculous and goofy. It's very over the top, which is appropriate to the style of the time, but given the nature of this particular issue's plot, it really doesn't work for the content at hand. We're dealing with a serious Batman dealing with a very serious situation in a war zone, so I feel like it needs a little bit more realism than what the artwork actually presents. Perhaps it's a limit of the art styling of the 1990s. This comic does feel a little dated in that regard, and not with the fun sort of nostalgia that I can look at with the older comics. This comic is too recent for that sort of talk, but a little too old for it to be considered a fully fledged modern comic. This is a 90s comic through and through, and that is an era of comic book history all unto itself. In fact, that's why we're reviewing an annual in the 90s, and why we're only 10 annuals in for a series that's well over 600 issues deep. It's because annuals hadn't been published in Detective Comics up until sometime after the Crisis of Infinite Earths. We're 10 years out from that now, in a year that really sticks out to me in terms of comic book history. 1997, when the whole industry almost cratered in on itself. For a number of complicated reasons, but we kind of see it even in this comic itself. Its mere existence, the fact that it's an annual in a series that, by and large, outside of this run, didn't really have annuals, kind of says something. The 90s, up until this point, were a period of excess. Comics were being pushed out, big events like Death of Superman were happening, and a speculative market had grown in the industry, which basically created a bubble where comics were being valued at more and more. People were in a rush to buy these new ones, thinking they'd be valuable one day. And when they started to realize that wouldn't be the case for the 90s comics, which were printed at levels so high that they would never be as valuable as these old Silver Age comics had come to be by then in comic book history, the value and interest in these comics plummeted, and the whole industry nearly collapsed, right around this time. It is not a coincidence that we are 10 annuals in to a 12 annual run, and the practice would stop in around 1999, basically because DC had to tighten the belt. They survived this whole period, obviously, but things weren't easy for them, and they experienced a dramatic loss in sales going forward from this, owing to, well, what happened in the 90s to the comic book industry. It's not a great time, and it is worth noting that. It just feels relevant, especially given when this comic was published. So yes, this comic has some problems. It is a byproduct of its time, through and through. But don't get me wrong, that does not mean that I am not recommending this thing. I am 100% recommending this comic. It was a lot of fun, and, well, pretty much any Batman comic by Chuck Dixon is gonna be one hell of a ride. Overall, the entire climate of this comic has improved. The artwork has a lot more detail and quality to it. The content itself is much more sophisticated and intelligent. And even though I don't necessarily agree with Chuck Dixon on everything politically, I really do appreciate the political angles of this comic. He does a really good job at making it interesting and appropriate to Batman, while also kind of getting into a more intelligent political story than what we're used to. This is almost like a Black Hawk Down or Argo type of operation told in a Batman story, and that really works for me. Chuck Dixon uses contemporary events of the 90s and probably fiction similar to those sort of movies from that time period to tell a really cool and different Batman story. As an annual, it works really well. It's sort of this side thing, and though not much of a mystery, there are mystery elements to it. Elements that were conveyed to me almost immediately at the beginning of the story, but decent elements at that. This comic is long, told in chapters, and featuring a lot of great content, and a lot of really awesome stuff with Batman working his way through a jungle, fighting these militia and terrorist groups, and finding the truth of the matter to ultimately save his friends. It's a great comic, and one that I do recommend. Next up, we're going a decade ahead, once again, to the early 2000s, with a really cool comic that is a sort of prelude to an even cooler event. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. If you like Comic Island, be sure to check out our Patreon page in the video description below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.